that. Is Cine EI pointless? Maybe. Let's see if we can figure it out. The point of Cine EI is to maintain the maximum dynamic range and quality of your image. The assumption is that A, you lose dynamic range if you deviate from the base ISO, and or B, you lose quality in the form of grain, fixed pattern noise, whatever you want to call it. I've already made a really in-depth video about Cine EI, what, why, and how, so if you don't really know what it is, I'd highly recommend you go watch that video. In a nutshell, all Cine EI really is a way to expose your camera and to monitor that exposure. It doesn't change the quality of the recording. It doesn't put it into some sort of secret mode that other cameras don't have. It really is just a method of exposing and monitoring your exposure. When you are in Cine EI mode, you only have your base ISOs to choose from. So most of these cameras have essentially two base ISOs. So for the FX30, you have a low base of 800 and a high base of 2500. And when you are in Cine EI, no matter what the exposure is looking like, no matter what the EI value is reading, you're still in that base ISO. But is there really a difference in using Cine EI and shifting your EI value above and below the base ISO, or just shifting your ISO? And that's what we're going to find out in this video. I want to give credit to a couple commenters on my Cine EI video for prompting me to explore this topic, and also some YouTube creators who have directly informed me in making this video. So I'm going to put all that in the end of the video, so stick around for that for some recommendations. When you switch the ISO to lower than base ISO in the newer Sony cameras, basically the a7S III onward, I think, you get two little lines above and below the ISO value. And the accepted wisdom has essentially become that if you shoot this way, you are losing quality somehow. But what I want to show you in this video is that there's zero difference in terms of quality, in terms of dynamic range, in shooting at a lower than base ISO, as opposed to shooting in Cine EI at a lower EI value. Sony has a chart that shows you what happens to the dynamic range of the camera when you shift the EI values. And I showed this in my Cine EI video. So essentially, they're saying, you have a finite amount of dynamic range in this theoretical camera. I don't really know which camera it is, but it doesn't matter. As you increase the EI value, so above the base ISO, the amount of dynamic range stays the same, so 15 stops in this case. But as you increase the EI value, you get more latitude in the highlights above middle gray, and you get less latitude in the shadows below middle gray. And then if you go the opposite direction and decrease your EI value, so the EI is going below the base ISO, you get fewer stops of dynamic range above middle gray and more stops below middle gray. When I presented this chart in my Cine EI video, what I said was that this is what happens when you shift your ISO. And that wasn't really a mistake. That's something that I actually think happens, and that's what I want to show you in this video. And Blackmagic Design has a very similar chart that accompanies some of its cameras, which show you the exact same thing, but instead of Cine EI, which of course they don't have in their cameras, it's showing you what happens as you shift the ISO above and below the base ISO. I have a bunch of test shots shot with the FX30 in 4K 120. You might know that if you go into the 4K 120 mode in the FX30, it has a tendency to become very noisy. Sort of like a bonus tip for this video, like how to get clean images in 4K 120 with the FX30. Also, this shot here that you've been watching and listening to, currently using Cine EI, so the base ISO is at 800, and I'm using an EI value of 400. But later on, I'm going to switch to flexible ISO and just change the ISO to 400. And so we can compare this shot as well. I'm going to run through these comparison shots pretty quickly, so if you need to pause, go right ahead. I exposed for the gray card that is in the shots at about 43, 44 IRE, so you can see how all the exposures should match. If you're still confused about Cine EI, you don't really know what's going on, I highly encourage you to go back and watch that video. But with all these shots that are in Cine EI, the exposure has been adjusted in post. So they're actually captured, in this case, because the EI value is lower than the base ISO, they have been captured much brighter, or at least a stop or two brighter than you're actually seeing on the screen. And the point of these comparisons is so you can see, regardless of whether you shot in Cine EI or flexible ISO, as long as the EI value and the ISO match, you're essentially getting the same image. The most important thing is to understand that you're not getting any extra dynamic range by shooting in Cine EI because you're at the base ISO. Conventional wisdom is that you get the most dynamic range shooting at the base ISO, but what I'm trying to illustrate in this video is that it's not the case. The only thing that happens is that you shift the allocation of dynamic range up or down as you change your ISO up or down. Super important thing to understand is that we're not gaining any dynamic range by shooting in Cine EI versus shooting in flexible ISO. This lime green shot here is Cine EI at 200, and then this pink shot here is at ISO 200. And you can see that the exposure corrected shot in Cine EI is the same as the flexible ISO shot. There's nothing to be gained in the highlights. So we're going to go to the color page here, and I'll show you that real quick. This is what it looks like right at a camera. So we've overexposed it quite a bit, and if we adjust the exposure, this is what we get. So I'm exposing for this gray card, and you can see that here. This is the gray card, and it's exposed for about 43, 44 IRE. Right at a camera, it's up here at about 64 IRE, and then when we adjust it, now it's down here. But notice we have still clipped our highlights. And regardless of what I do, even though we're in ISO 800, the base ISO, the one where we should have the most dynamic range, if you listen to what everybody says, we still clip. No matter what we do here with the highlights, what's clipped is clipped. And comparing that to the ISO 200, it's the same, sort of clipped highlight information, and, we can't do anything with that. Now that we've seen all the test images and we've played around a little bit with the exposure in post, I think it's safe to conclude that there's really no benefit in terms of image quality, dynamic range, grain, etc., in using Cine EI versus just using an equivalent ISO. So what the hell is Cine EI even for then? And I'm not trying to present myself as an expert. I'm just trying to present this information that I've actually done the work on, done the testing, and present it to you. So if there's something that I've missed, something that I'm not taking into account, please let us know in the comments. I can see one benefit of shooting in Cine EI. Say you maybe overcompensated with your EI value. So in this shot right here, maybe I shot in Cine EI 200. I adjust the image in post, and maybe it's just a little bit too dark and it's not exactly what I want. Well, of course, the actual image that was captured is a lot brighter than the image that I was monitoring. So I don't have to pull it all the way down. But where I think Sony may be trying to fool us a little bit is you don't have that base dynamic range of ISO 800. You've exposed the camera, you've exposed the sensor as if you were shooting in ISO 200 or ISO 400. So if you've clipped the highlights, which you probably have in this instance, you've clipped the highlights. You don't have the same sort of neutral exposure that you would get if you monitored and exposed for ISO 800. It doesn't really work that way. I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned something. Any comments, you know where to go. As always, I appreciate watching the video, and maybe I'll see you in another one.
At 400.